Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. I am Thea Lee, president of the Economic Policy Institute. For 34 years, EPI has brought the voices and concerns of working people into the economic policy debate. We use rigorous empirical research and policy analysis to educate policymakers, journalists, and activists on the impact of actual and proposed economic policies. We focus on worker justice and racial and gender equality. And through our economic analysis and research network, we are connected to almost 60 state-level policy and advocacy organizations around the country. We are delighted to host today's webinar. The coronavirus pandemic poses major challenges to U.S. students and teachers and exacerbates existing education inequities. A plan for relief, recovery, and rebuilding. Today's webinar will focus on the new challenges students, teachers, and parents are facing in this unprecedented world that we are living in. We draw on pre-COVID research to understand the magnitude of these challenges and to lay out the kinds of policies we'll need to make sure the most vulnerable students and families are not permanently disadvantaged. We are extremely fortunate to have with us today Randy Weingarten to kick off this discussion. Randy is the president of the American Federations of Teachers and a valued member of EPI's board of directors. Randy has been a tremendously powerful and articulate voice for teachers and for the labor movement, and we are privileged to work closely with her and the amazing team at AFT. Randy is an innovator, a coalition builder, and a strategic partner. She is fearless and tireless as a champion for teachers, communities, and students. Randy, we are looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Thea. Thank you, Thea. Can you, I want to just make sure that I am good. I heard backfeed, but I think I got that done. I think I got that over. So thank you, Thea, and thank you, Emma and Elaine, for doing this amazing report. I have my copy of it that I have been flipping through, and I think it's really important, and we're going to make it part of the work that we get out to the field. I also am really glad that Ivy is going to be on this panel too. And, you know, I basically want in about 5 minutes to both make people feel really, really depressed, but end with some hope, which is there's no good choices right now. The only good choice would have been that Donald Trump fought the virus, had a national plan, and I'm not saying I'll not, you know, schooling is basically done local by local, district by district. So we're not talking about a top-down national plan where you specify everything that happens. But there could have been, just like the use of the Defense Production Act, just like what countries had done all throughout the world in terms of dealing with this, there could have been a national strategy and response that made getting back to in-school learning one of the most important things that we were doing for kids in places that it was safe. That is actually, given the poll results that we just got yesterday from both teachers and parents, that's what teachers and parents wanted. They know that there's still a pandemic. They know safety comes first. They want safety of their kids and of our members to come first. And they're scared about what's going on because of how inchoate, how contradictory, how incompetent, how mishandled the national reaction has been. And so, but what parents and teachers both tell us, teachers 79%, parents 71%, that if we could have had the safeguards, or still can get the safeguards that actually reduce community spread, create the testing and tracing to ensure that an outbreak doesn't become a surge, and have the safeguards that are necessary in schools to prevent spread, that they would want to be back in school and in school learning, because everyone understands just how bad remote is. You don't have to see what happened to Miami-Dade, where like 2 weeks after they had the contract with K-12 Inc., $15 million worth of a contract, they canceled it because we know that remote education, particularly for-profit remote education, is not a substitute for in-school. And remote education, even when we do it in some ways the best ways, and teachers have been pretty creative about standing up remote education, it isn't a substitute. It is only really a long-term supplement to what we do in terms of in schools. So when I say and start with there's no good choices because we didn't fight the virus, or because Donald Trump didn't fight the virus, there are no good choices. What does that leave us with? What it leaves us with is essentially a tale of two countries right now. You got the country, actually three countries, let me be fair. You got the country that has been in denial, like a Florida, like a Texas, like a Georgia, and where they just downplay the virus. And the only reason that there's been any safeguards whatsoever is that Atlanta had safeguards, and that it required, as a result, the string of suburbs around Atlanta, parents basically with teachers convincing school boards that you needed to have masks and some kind of hybrid environment for physical distancing. But then in Florida, you had such a bad situation in August. Our union actually sued to let local control actually happen, because what Florida was doing is, while they allowed the southern part of Florida to actually open remotely, they would not let the I-4 corridor open remotely. And you had thousands of or hundreds of situations now where you have school classrooms and things closing because of COVID. And unfortunately, you now have a governor who refuses to even disclose the information. So you have that in terms of the deniers. And then you have the places that we're trying to do, the places that are trying to do the right thing, that are trying to actually make safety come first, some of which have really defaulted to remote because they couldn't happen, and some of which is happening, but like take a place like New York, it's happening badly. We had a situation in New York last week, I swear to you, I heard it myself, where a superintendent of special needs kids actually said, when told that one of the schools in his site was terrible, was told, it's not my job, it's not my responsibility. So you have situations where the safety protocols have not been met and there's real great distrust. And so that's the story around the country. In terms of remote education, we had a seminar this week because we know still 20 to 30% of kids in America don't really have access readily made to the devices they need or the connectivity they need. And the big difference between this year and last year is that last year, at least March, April, May, we all knew our kids. This year, unless people are looping, there's all sorts of differences. So we got basically a really bad scenario where we need to make the best of it. And we need to actually find ways to meaningfully instruct kids both remotely and in basically a hybrid model where we deal with kids' well-being first and foremost because of all the agita that kids feel because of the 4 crises that we're in, whether it's the pandemic, the recession, the long needed reckoning with racism, or climate issues. There's a lot of agita that kids bring with them. And so what we need to start doing is, whether we're in a remote or a hybrid situation, is really keep on fighting for the safeguards that the experts have told us. Reduce positivity rates in communities, having a testing and tracing situation and isolation process, having what I call the big 6, which is mask, physical distancing, cleaning, ventilation, reasonable accommodation for those who are high risk, and hand washing, screening over and over and over again. Those things have to be resourced. Those things have to be in schools. Those things are not negotiable. And then whether we're in a hybrid or whether we're in a remote situation, how we make remote better, how we make remote better, how we make sure that we have the hotspots, how we make sure we have the curriculum, how we keep some limitations in terms of kids on screens, how we allow asynchronistic learning, how we get best practices from teachers about what is and what isn't working, create flexibility, let them, and then see what happens as the year goes on. Last thing I'll say is this: the things that we know that work the best were the things that we knew months and years ago that worked the best. Places that actually had community schools, wraparound services beforehand. Those are places that have actually been able to meet the needs of kids and in terms of well-being in a much better way. Places that were actually able to stand up, grab and goes, and the issue about food insecurity is real, and the resources that we need to actually extend food services is very real. But those places that had those processes are places that are doing better right now. And last, those places that actually focused on teaching and critical thinking and project-based instruction and capstones projects and portfolio assessments, as opposed to standardized tests and teaching to the test, those places were able to actually move that kind of learning to remote in a way that that they didn't, in a way that that places that were really focused on test scores did not. So we need a lot of grace. We need to meet children's needs. We need to keep things safe first and foremost, meet children and staff's well-being needs, and then start really looking at what are the best practices in terms of remote, and ultimately hope and pray that we're going to get the resources and a vaccine and other kinds of things so that we can, before the end of the year, start slowly and gradually and responsibly having more and more in-school instruction.
Well, thank you so much, Randy, for that great opening. Next, I would like to introduce our panel, and I think it leads right into the conversation we're going to have in terms of what we know about what works and what doesn't work and what we need to do next. So our first panelist is Emma Garcia. She is EPI's education economist. She has her PhD in economics and education from Columbia University's Teachers College. Elaine Weiss is an EPI research associate and lead policy analyst for income security at the National Academy of Social Insurance. She has her law degree from Harvard Law School, PhD in public policy from George Washington University. Emma and Elise co-authored the report that inspired today's webinar, and they have been frequent and fruitful collaborators for several years. And finally, we are truly delighted to also have with us today Ivy Welshons. Ivy is the special education liaison at MYA Middle School in Philadelphia. She attended Mansfield University, Lock Haven University, and Temple University. And she earned National Board Teacher Certification in 2013 and was awarded the Lindback Award for Distinguished Teaching. Emma?
So thank you very much, Cynthia, for this kind introduction. I want to start by thanking my colleagues and EPI for having organized this webinar and for the support for this research. I also want to thank Randy and Ivy for Randy for her powerful remarks, and Ivy for her daily work and for her willingness to share the reality with us. So Elaine and I are gonna provide a short overview of our COVID-19 and education policy report, including some of the findings in the report and our goals when we got started on it. There's a lot more in the paper and in some forthcoming pieces that we are working on, and I would like to invite you to download the report on EPI's website. Elaine, please, next slide.
Thanks so much, Emma. So when Emma and I started writing this paper, or really conducting the work to write this paper, we felt that it was critically important to shift away from what tends to be the automatic question in the field, how much did children learn, to a more important question that Randy alluded to. What is happening to our children and what do we need to do about that? In other words, we wanted to move from outcomes, which are more about symptoms, to inputs, drivers of problems, and associated policy actions. Indeed, when you read the paper, which I know you all will, you'll see that we avoid talking about achievement gaps, which are those symptoms, and instead we describe the interruptions and disruptions of children's education that have happened. In order to understand what's going on, we conducted two interconnected explorations. First, what does pandemic relevant research tell us about the learning and development that has happened and not happened over the past 6 months and is going on now. And number two, how has the pandemic and associated economic crisis played out for children generally and for various subgroups of children? And therefore, what can we learn about changes in disparities in opportunity or opportunity gaps? And I'm going to let Emma start out by summarizing that pandemic relevant research.
Thanks, Elaine. Next slide, please, Nina. So as Elaine was alluding to, we are using this approach. We are focusing on the processes and the mechanisms that drive the outcomes, what's sometimes called the black box in causal inference, to identify lessons that we will use to outline our policy recommendations. And as Randy was saying, we knew a lot of the things that worked years ago. So that's why still this pre-pandemic research continues to be useful and important if you look into it from a different perspective. There are many more examples in the paper, but here we are selecting a couple just to give you a hint of what we find and how we are interpreting this existing knowledge from the perspective of the pandemic. So for obvious reasons, there's been a lot of discussion on the so-called, quote, remote learning and remote teaching on a homeschooling setting, closing quotes. In the paper, we check what the requirements for effective remote education are, as well as how far a typical, intentional, well-resourced homeschooling setup was from the reality for many of our students. Aside from inviting you to read this in the paper, I am skipping them on purpose because Ivy is the best voice to talk about them. And we also look forward to discussing them with the audience in the Q&A as well. For the talk instead, I am going to focus on a few areas of research that may have received less attention so far, but are extremely helpful to lay out what to do next after you revisit that the working mechanisms from the perspective of the pandemic. Next, please, Nina. Next, please. So I'm gonna focus on just 3 bodies of work that tell us about the potential learning and development during the pandemic, and will also tell us a lot about how to lift up that learning and development in the aftermath of the pandemic. The first one is the evidence on learning time, which tells us that decisions about extending the school schedules, maybe extending the school year, will have to ensure that instruction is of high quality. And that means a lot of things. That involves instruction that is of the right intensity. It involves after-school activities that also support the development of the whole child. It involves smaller class sizes, and of course, having sufficient highly credentialed staff who also get the right support. That evidence, especially the one on summer learning, tell us that children learn very differently, which we will also have to address by offering more personalized and flexible instruction. The research on chronic absenteeism reinforces the urgency of providing appropriate support to students who are least prepared, and especially to those at risk of becoming disengaged and eventually dropping out. Just to signal that we are not alone on this, the United Nations has recently defined this as a potential generational catastrophe. From the research on education in emergencies, we learned 2 main things. First, that contingency plans play a critical role mitigating the impacts of recessions, natural disasters, and pandemics on learning and development. And second, that there are large costs associated with reduced education spending that often follows an economic crisis. Elaine, please. Nina, please.
So, as Emma described, the research, the pandemic relevant research illustrates how and why opportunity gaps are likely growing a lot in the academic context, but we know that their growth is broader than that. So for example, we're all very well aware of the digital divide, the degree to which low-income students and students in rural areas in particular often lack access to strong internet or any internet connection. But that's really only the tip of the iceberg. As Randy discussed, some kids may not even have a device that they can use to connect, or as we know, some kids are needing to share it with a sibling or two, which obviously isn't going to work during the school day. They cannot all be on it together, all learning. But just as important, as our EPI colleagues note in a recent paper, those are the same subgroups of students who are the most likely to have parents working low-income frontline jobs. And that means one of two things. Either they're more likely to have lost those jobs in the past few months, and probably with that their health insurance, which means they're under tremendous stress. They're struggling with food insecurity, hunger, needing to pay rent, and quite possibly eviction. Or if they've been lucky enough not to lose those jobs, those parents are not available to provide the support for remote learning that evidence makes abundantly clear is critical if it is to work properly. And of course, they are much more likely to be exposed to COVID, become sick, and create traumas in those households. So the bottom line for us in this paper is how these various factors and others that we discuss exacerbate greatly the opportunity gaps that were already extremely evident before COVID came along. Which leads us to what we say we need to do. Nina, can we have the next slide? So understanding all of these challenges that children are facing, academic and other challenges, guided our policy recommendations, which are geared to alleviating those challenges. And we set forth 3 key components that we hope will reframe the education policy discussion now. First, and most immediately, schools have to get relief. The resources and supports they need for education to function while many schools remain closed. And this can range from providing meals in school parking lots to purchasing Chromebooks for every child in the district. Second, as schools begin to open and they're in the recovery phase, they must prioritize diagnostic assessments, as both Emma and Randy said, to identify where children are. We anticipate this means the need for more personalized learning, more intensive interventions, and increased attention both for students and teachers to social and emotional learning. And given what we know and have written about persistent teacher shortages, districts are going to need strategies to retain especially their highly credentialed teachers, many of whom they are at risk to losing because of this crisis. And finally, while this crisis does pose enormous challenges, it also presents unique opportunities. As my colleague CJ Huff in Joplin, Missouri learned after a Category 5 tornado leveled much of his city, rebuilding provides a chance to finally do the things that you should have done a long time ago. This pandemic has laid bare how stark inequities infect virtually every aspect of US life and the dire consequences for all of us of allowing those inequities to persist. We thus end this paper with an urgent call to renew the redesign of public education systems to focus on nurturing the whole child and to break the links between poverty, segregation, and education to ensure that all children and each child has access to the conditions and resources that enhance learning and development. Before I turn this over to Ivy, from whom I'm very, very eager to learn, I want to emphasize one more key finding revealed by our paper. And that is that education policy alone, as important as it is, cannot by itself ensure that all children have the foundation that they need for a good education. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me today. It is my pleasure to talk about how teaching during the pandemic has really affected our students and teachers. This pandemic has placed additional stressors on an already fragile educational system. Schools are the ultimate checks and balances when it comes to making sure that our students are safe, making sure that their basic needs are being met. We oftentimes come across abused and neglected children, and they rely on us to be the point of contact to put them in safe situations. With this pandemic, we do not have the resources to be able to make sure that our students are safe. I have multiple students that I have not seen virtually or physically since March 13th, and they're still on our roll. So for teachers across the United States, this is very common. These numbers far exceed what anyone would deem acceptable. So the first thing that we need to worry about is the safety of our students. You know, and the next thing is there's always been a very huge divide in funding and resources between the haves and the have-nots. What wealthier school districts can provide looks very different from something in an urban setting or in a very rural setting. If the pandemic has done nothing else, it has glaringly shown the disparities that in between urban and rural and other districts that we've been dealing with for years. We've been dealing with the lack of technology, outdated technology, the lack of teacher experience with technological platforms, limited digital resources, and quite frankly, the lack of financial resources that would enable us to quickly springboard into teaching digitally. In March, from March 13th until mid-April, the School District of Philadelphia did not teach. So we had over a month of instruction that was lost. I know, for example, my brother teaches in a very rural district in Pennsylvania. They too did not have the money to purchase technology, and they provided learning packets. So they didn't teach the entire spring semester. So here we have students that already are at a disadvantage, missing out on key instructional opportunities. I think one of the other things that was touched upon is that both rural and urban districts have parents that are mainly essential workers. They lack internet for various reasons. They lack technology. And they also aren't able to be home with their students. They are not as fortunate as some people in wealthier districts where the parents can afford to hire a retired teacher and create learning pods. This is not happening for us in Philadelphia. And this just makes it more glaringly obvious, you know, how we are doing a disservice to our children. So we've just embarked in the 2020 school year. We have been able to provide Chromebooks and internet access. It does require parents going to get the Chromebooks and making the effort to get the internet access. We're fortunate that a lot of our parents have done that. There are still parents that have not done this for their children. One of the larger issues now is they have access to this technology, but we're really supposed to be teaching 21st century skills in schools, but we lack the technology to be able to do that. So now we have families and children that have Chromebooks and they can't access the digital platforms that they need to be in. So many of these children, if they're not alone, are with their elder relatives who also cannot help them. So, you know, as teachers, we're dealing with this. I think it's important to know that teachers across the United States that are working in a digital platform are spending hours of their prep time, their lunch and evenings, working with students and parents, teaching them how to access digital classrooms, submit work, troubleshoot. The amount of energy that it requires to teach digitally is so much more than I ever did in a classroom. And I work hard in a classroom. But the amount of energy to be able to connect and motivate children in a virtual world while they're watching TV, playing games, have other people in their area is just exhausting. You have to have tons of patience. There's tons of challenges. You're repeating directions. You're trying to make sure everyone is where they're supposed to be. 3 different devices in front of us. One to make sure that we have all of our kids, the other to present. It's absolutely exhausting. It's September 16th, and teachers are working harder than they ever have in their lives, worrying about their students' well-being, making sure that they have enough food, making sure that they can access the curriculum. And as a special education liaison working with students with learning differences, I find this incredibly hard to take because I don't know how students in general, let alone special education students, are going to be able to recoup their academic skills. You know, I'm working hard to fill the gaps, but in reality, when we go back to a brick and mortar building, there are going to be gaps, not only for special ed, for regular ed, but even for our students that are English language learners. I think that we need to take a hard look where we are right now in education. We had nothing put in place to make sure that we could move and, you know, not that we knew a pandemic was going to come, but there was no contingency plan, nothing to fall back on. So I think that we really need to start looking at how we supply schools with what they need, making sure that your zip code does not determine your worth or the type of education that you're afforded or the supplies that you have in your school, because we really are working hard and we're worried sick about our students. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Ivy. Thank you for being with us here today, and thank you for everything you do in the classroom. And I'm the mom of a middle school teacher, and I know just how challenging it can be and is. I wanted to start out, thanks to all of you for being here. Please keep using the Q&A box, and we will take some of your questions in a minute. I wanted to start with one question for all of our panelists today, and it's kind of an overview, a big picture question. You all talked about resources, and Emma and Elise, you talked about relief, recovery, and rebuilding. And Ivy, in particular, you focused in on this too, about what is needed to do this right and to make sure that we are not exacerbating the inequalities, which is definitely happening. We know that the Congress is paralyzed right now. They have been contemplating what a fourth round of COVID relief might look like. Of course, the House of Representatives passed the HEROES Act back in May that would send another $1 trillion to state and local governments. That would be one really important way of providing some of the resources that are needed to do education right. If I could ask each of you to just say a couple of sentences about what are the consequences? What would you tell Congress are the consequences of not acting right now to give the resources that are needed to state and local governments? What does that mean for students, for inequality, for our future? Randy, maybe start with you.
So everything that Ivy said, I'm hearing all across the country. And yet, even with that, people believe in safety first, but there is no sense of what this really means in terms of teacher time and efficaciousness for both kids and teachers, what we're doing. There's this sense around the country that teachers will just figure this out. And most of the time, you can, even if you have a terrible ventilation system, you'll still teach because teachers will just figure it out. Even though you don't have soap in a school, you'll just teach because teachers will figure it out. There's kind of like a point of no return here. And what Ivy just said about it's September 16th and people feel like they are working, like they feel like it's June 30th on September 16th. And part of this, and then I'm going to get to the resource issue. Part of this is also that no one above a teacher or a principal rank has wanted to take real responsibility. And I'm not being critical of superintendents, but they haven't wanted to take real responsibility for what does a district look like? What does a school look like? How do you create the working conditions that are going to be efficacious to teaching and learning? And a lot of that, I think, is because no one wants to take responsibility for liability. So I've never seen so much responsibility being kicked down to the ground level, the school level, where there is the least amount of resources. And that gets you to the resource question that you also asked as well, which is the most infuriating aspect of many infuriating aspects. If you took leaders like Trump or McConnell or Lamar Alexander or all these people who have said how important in-school learning is, how important education is, how important dealing with social emotional is. None of them did anything to get us the money to do any of it. This is a solvable, we have a pandemic, but the experts have told us what we require to actually open schools and to do these things. And that money isn't there. We are seeing 20% budget cuts when we actually need 20% increases. And it is the inequities, the train wreck, all of this that we see on the ground. It is this incredible sign of disrespect and how kids, particularly Black and brown kids and kids in rural and city areas, are just not a priority. This time, teachers can't do it all. We actually need the resources. And the most obnoxious thing I saw in our poll this week, which was completely predictable to us and particularly obvious to us, is that 9 out of 10 teachers are buying their own PPE and already buying the PPE for their kids. So it's like, we have to stop actually having the rhetoric that schooling is important. It's not the rhetoric that schooling is important. It's actually what is happening on the ground and how communities, and particularly McConnell, Trump, Congress of the United States spends its money. Are schools priorities or not? And right now, I don't care what they say, they clearly are not.
And I would absolutely not only echo, but if we want to understand what the economic consequences are going to be from this totally catastrophic, I wouldn't even call it a failure of leadership, just a lack of leadership. Let's start with how many more kids are going to get retained in grade. Let's go on to how many more kids are going to need incredibly expensive remedial education that they should not have to have, but are now going to need. Then let's go on to the economic disaster associated with how many more students are, as we speak, becoming disengaged from school and will end up dropping out as a result of this. And let's cap that off with how many kids will now not go to college because we prioritized open bars before giving resources to schools. I mean, that's the reality. If they care about dollars, there are the dollars.
I think that you forgot a very important piece. Not only you're setting kids up for failure, so now you have the school to prison pipeline that we have to take into account, especially for our brown and Black children.
So true.
I want to say 3 short things that have to do with the way we treat resources. So one is that the resources that we have in schools are a critical component of the safety net. So if you do not allow schools to operate normally, you are just cutting on the access of very many kids to basic services. So that's an issue. That's a huge issue and something that should really speed up the access and the availability to resources. And the other one, the other 2 little ones have to do with the less you do on the relief stage, the more you will have to do on the other components. So this is not a trade-off. This is just you are making your problems larger. And the last point I wanted to say about resources, while it's critical that we have resources to ensure safety associated with the pandemic, the investments and the disinvestments are not a new thing in education policy. They have been with us for years, for decades. From CBPP, we know that still about half of the states are spending less per student than they were prior to the prior recession. So this is not a pile that you build up overnight. This is something, a pile or a problem that you were building for years.
Thank you, Emma and Elise and Randy. And Ivy, did you have more you wanted to add there or was? Okay. Yeah, I think those points are incredibly important because a lot of times we're hearing this kind of dopey refrain from policymakers, which is that we can't afford to spend the money on state and local aid and on the money for teachers. And I think the point that you all have made is really important, which is that we can't afford not to spend this money because we're going to spend it one way or the other, either in dealing with the aftermath and the damage that we've created as we have a generation of students that will face learning deficits and some lifelong problems if we don't step up right now. So thank you so much for those great responses. And I'm going to go to the questions from the question and answer box. Let's see, let's start with this one. This is actually two questions. How are the emotional problems and emotional development of children being affected by the virus and its consequences? What types of social emotional programs do you feel students need in order to deal with the trauma many of them have faced? And let any of you take a crack at that.
I would like to
Ivy?
answer. So one of the things that we're doing to deal with the emotional toll that is taken on our students is that we are working really hard to make connections with our students. We have morning meeting every day, and we are scheduling one-on-one meetings with our students, trying to meet them where they are, asking them silly questions to make sure that they're eating, you know, finding out what they've been doing, just engaging with them just to see if they're all right. It's the best that we can do in a situation like this right now. Checking up on students that we know had trouble in the previous school year, but it's a no-win situation. You know, you're doing the best you can in a really ugly time.
If I may, Elaine and I have worked on socio-emotional skills and their development and the development of the whole child for a number of years now. And we have always noticed that teachers knew. Education policy may have overlooked at those skills, but teachers know, just like parents know. And that for those thinking, well, we have no time, we are behind, we really have to go on to the testing. The reality is that all the skills develop in tandem. One nurtures and reinforces the other. So it's not one or the other. They go together, and teachers know, and that's why we really have to think about in this reimagining our education system and what it needs. We see as critical that we really put the emphasis on developing the whole child, and that has implications and repercussions for testing and assessments and understanding what you really need to get a child educated.
And I want to add one more point. Totally agree. Emma and I have really felt that our prior work on social and emotional learning was incredibly pertinent to the work that we were doing here. But I want to loop back to something Randy said at the beginning that I think is so important and so true, and that is that districts that have been employing a community school strategy are really ahead of the game here, as we knew they would be in this kind of situation. And that is because they already understood the importance of social and emotional learning and of nurturing those skills, but also of attending to the basic needs that ensure that those skills can be nurtured. I've been working with other colleagues with a set of community school type districts, and they are all over the place. They are delivering food to every kid. They are looking at those basic needs. They are talking to parents about housing problems, the kinds of things that make life really traumatic for kids and frankly make it impossible, even for amazing teachers like Ivy, to do their jobs, because kids who are threatened with eviction and haven't eaten in 24 hours can't learn, no matter how amazing things are. So, you know, community schools are way ahead of their time. And let's hope that if one huge lesson comes out of this, it's that we need them to be the norm. It's always been true, but it has never been clearer than it is right now.
Thank you. Let's go on to another question from the folks. Here is one. Let's see. Hold on. This is maybe a very practical question. Does the American school infrastructure allow for distant social standards to be met in classrooms? And how do you face these challenges? Maybe start with you, Ivy.
Not very well. Social standards?
Distancing?
I mean, no, I don't think that we're learning. I don't think it was ever anything that was made a priority. So we definitely need to step up our game. But no, I don't believe so.
Okay. And this is a very practical question also, and maybe for Randy. According to some reports, some districts across the country have compelled or are compelling teachers to teach in unsafe environments. If this is true, do teachers have any recourse against these districts?
Well, look, we are looking into all of that now, obviously, including all sorts of liability issues and everything else. But at the end of the day, this is why in July, in April, we actually stood up what we thought the standards should be. The first CDC standards, which came out in May, end of May, pretty much tracked a lot of what we said. I'm not saying that they looked at what we said, but what we said really was about the science, and we really listened to what the scientists and the safety experts were telling us. But at the end of the day, we're seeing, well, let me say it this way. So we did that in April, and in July, we basically said, if these things don't happen, we'll go to court, we'll try to negotiate, we'll advocate, we'll go to court, and we as a national union will support any local who goes on strike for these things, regardless of whether a strike is legal or not. And so we will keep on doing these things. There will be a case or two of, because unfortunately people will get sick. And we've already seen, like in my union, we've had 210 members, AFT members, who have died of COVID. Many have been nurses. Many were educators who got sick in March and April. We've already seen 6 educators die since the start of the school year in Missouri, South Carolina, Mississippi. And so there's going to be other kind of recourse that we will help fight for on behalf of our members, both collectively as well as individually. But most important, I think, is not what we do on an individual basis. Most important is what are we going to do on a collective basis for the United States? Because we don't have enough density in terms of unionization, as much as, and Thea, you and I have talked about this so much. You see, 65% of the public want unions now, have a favorable view. But in the absence of that density, we need to actually use the density we have to create safety standards all across America, whether it's in meatpacking, whether it's Amazon workers, whether it's in schools, whether it is actually fighting. And in a new administration, I assume we will get, in a different administration, a Biden administration, I assume we will get this, having OSHA, having enforcement standards that are going to be far more. When they see what happened in the meatpacking industry, they saw the problems, and the fines were so pitiful that it sent a message to the meatpackers that doesn't matter, that's part of the cost of doing business. We have to make sure that safety issues, the cost of violating safeguards, are so high that that businesses, both public and private, will say that it is far better to actually do the safety standards than make it just a cost of doing business.
And isn't that exactly the opposite of what Senator Mitch McConnell is trying to do with his liability shield for businesses?
Right, exactly right.
Trying to protect businesses from having unsafe practices.
Right. So not give us the safeguards, and then on top of it, protect businesses for not having those safeguards. It is a lose-lose situation for working people. And it's basically a perfect example of how the rich and the well-heeled in this country basically run the table.
Ivy, I know you're active in your union at the local level. Do you have anything to add in terms of what it feels like on the ground level to have to make some of these hard decisions about safety versus in-person learning, and how do you balance those kinds of concerns?
You know, it's really interesting that you asked that, because right now, you know, Philadelphia is dealing with, you know, a systems crisis in terms of many of our buildings have asbestos, mold, poor air ventilation, students and staff being sick. We have a staff member that was diagnosed with mesothelioma. So we already have a health crisis, and now you throw in a pandemic. So it's really hard, to make that decision. We've already been exposed to a dangerous school system, and now they want us to go into a building without proper PPE. So it's very concerning, especially when the school district isn't willing to work with us to provide the proper, gear that we need, masks, having washing stations, making sure that there's ventilation set up. And their answer to that is, they'll meet us on our contract demands if we meet them on their demands for us to go back without safety protocols. So on the ground, it's hard, because I love teaching, but we don't want to die for it, so it's absolutely a horrible thing where I have to make a decision between my children and my family, like my students and my family. And that's what it'll come down to.
So if anyone hasn't seen it, I think all of this is incredibly cogently put forth, the disparity between when we say essential workers or how important education is in this country and what we do, what our actions say. I would point everybody to Cynthia Nixon's op-ed in the New York Times, describing in vivid detail the contrast between the epic efforts to keep her fancy TV studio workplace clean as a whistle, unbelievably safe, chock full of the highest quality PPE, and just shut down places, even if they might be safe, contrasting it with her son's school in Brooklyn, and she says, I kid you not, this is actually what they do. In order to figure out whether the ventilation system is working or not, they safety clipped a piece of paper to a ruler and held it in front of a vent. If that doesn't speak volumes about
Toilet paper.
prioritize in this country,
Toilet paper.
I do not know what does.
Okay, that's pretty graphic. I think we have time for one more question, and I think this follows on what we were just talking about. So here's a question from the Q&A box. What do you think about having school districts return following a principle of those who have the most needs should get support first, and have waves of educators and support deployed rather than all at once? Ask all of you to weigh in on that question. Randy?
Look, let's also just distinguish what Ivy just said about the buildings, or, issues where you have high positivity rates. So say you had buildings that had decent ventilation, that had soap, so you had those kinds of things. And you were in a low positivity jurisdiction, like say New York City. You have to do it in a gradual, responsible way. The notion that you can just throw everybody back in as if it was normal is crazy. And it creates the kind of agita and anxiety that Ivy was talking about, and that we see in our polling, and we see in terms of talking to our members and parents about wondering how that kind of situation could be safe. You have to create, probably the most important thing I can say is you have to create confidence of parents and educators that it's going to be safe. Just like what Elaine just said about how Cynthia Nixon's workplace was creating the confidence that it was going to be safe by putting those standards together, and by having a what happens if situation, not just having the standards, having the implementation. If we don't actually do that for schooling, which means that you start slowly and you start with people who are most at need, and then everybody sees if it works, and then you can do more and more and more. It has to be slow, responsible, gradual. The best memorandum of agreement on this that I have seen is what happened in Boston. Boston's is like an A+++ memorandum of understanding in terms of how to do this step by step by step.
Thank you so much, Randy. Any final words from Elaine, Emma, or Ivy? We're just around at the end of the hour.
I guess
Yeah, go ahead. Go
I
ahead.
would just hope that if we can prioritize high needs kids and high needs schools first, which certainly would be the polar opposite of everything that we've ever done in education policy, that it would set an example. And it would really be exactly what Emma and I are describing in terms of rebuilding. We need to radically rethink education policy. And if we started there, I think it would be fantastic.
I just want to add that aside from a lot of references and citations that we offer in the paper, there are tons of additional citations and work that our colleagues and everybody has been producing during these few months, but also before. We have known what works and for whom and why that matters and how much it costs for years. So I think we are at the right moment to really go for those recommendations and those interventions, because this is the foundation of our society.
Thank you, Emma. So thank you so much, Elaine and Emma, for your research and for being here today. Thank you, Randy, for your leadership. Thank you, Ivy, for your leadership and for your amazing service to America's children. And thanks to all of you who joined us this afternoon and for your excellent questions. With that, we will adjourn today's webinar. And thank you and have a wonderful evening.